Most Santa Maria sailors feared the endless ocean, but the real danger was the other men on board. This is how one young crewman navigated suspicion, sickness, and sabotage on the ship of Christopher Columbus, only to return home as the voyage's most unexpected success story. Hello, dear listener. Welcome to your journey to sleep on the Cozy Nights channel. Before we get started, feel free to like and subscribe. Now relax and join me on the voyage of a lifetime, the voyage that changed the world forever, aboard the ship of Christopher Columbus. The docks of Palos in 1492 weren't crowded with eager adventurers. They were filled with desperate men. The young sailor who would eventually stand on unknown shores signed up for one reason: he had nothing left to lose. Columbus didn't recruit nobles or merchants. He scraped together a crew from prison yards, debtors' alleys, and the ranks of bankrupt farmers. The contract promised gold, land, and royal pardons, but seasoned seamen knew better. They'd heard the distance calculations didn't add up, that the Genoese captain's maps were more hope than science. The young sailor didn't care whether he was running from debts, crimes, or starvation. The Santa Maria offered a way out, even if that way out might lead straight off the edge of the world. Of the 90 men who boarded the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria, only a handful were volunteers in the romantic sense. The rest were conscripts, convicts, or men so poor they'd signed their lives away for a daily wage of 1,000 maravedis, about 3 months' pay for a farmhand. The Captain General had royal authority to impress sailors from local taverns if needed. Many woke up with pounding headaches to find they'd volunteered overnight comedias. The roster read like a list of last chances. A cooper who'd gambled away his workshop, a rope maker with creditors at his heels, a blacksmith who'd brawled with the wrong noble's son. The young sailor's name doesn't survive. Maybe it was scrubbed from records after some petty theft. Maybe he never learned to write it down. What does survive is the crew manifest's most chilling line, a clause requiring all men to swear they'd sail west until the end. They weren't given a choice about that oath. Columbus's scribe recorded each X-mark signature with dry precision, knowing these men would either enrich Spain or disappear without a trace. The ships carried no extra food for the return voyage. Either they found land or they didn't come back. Below deck, the veterans muttered about the signs. The Santa Maria's hull groaned under the weight of excess cargo. The quartermaster's calculations kept coming up short on water barrels. Some sailors pocketed extra biscuits when no one was looking, preparing for the shortages they knew were coming. The night before departure, the young sailor likely sat with his back against a barrel near the docks, listening to the drunk ones brag about the silks they'd bring home, and the quiet ones stare at the dark water. No one mentioned the real math. Even if they found land, the chance of surviving the journey back was barely better than the chance of falling off the earth. When the tide turned at dawn, they boarded without ceremony. No cheering crowds, no fanfare, just the creak of ropes and the splash of oars as the harbour pilot guided them out. The young sailor wouldn't have looked back. For men like him, Europe had already run out of second chances. The Santa Maria wasn't designed for living. It was a floating warehouse with sails. Below deck, the ceiling was so low, grown men couldn't stand upright. Forget hammocks. Most of the crew slept on bare planks, slick with condensation, or curled between barrels of vinegar and gunpowder. The lucky ones got scraps of canvas to lay on. The rest woke up with splinters in their cheeks and the taste of salt in their mouths. The air never moved down there. It hung thick with the stink of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the sulphur stench of the ship's rats. Tar from the hull mingled with the sweet rot smell of the bilge water sloshing below the floorboards. When the waves picked up, vomit added its own sharp tang to the mix. You didn't breathe so much as swallow the air in gulps. There were no latrines. For privacy, sailors balanced over buckets or waited for darkness to hang their backsides over the rail. Miss your footing during a storm, and you'd be the first man lost overboard. The deck above was perforated with holes for rigging lines, so whenever waves crashed over the bow, freezing salt water rained down on the men trying to sleep. Dysentery spread faster than gossip. One man would wake up with cramps, and by sundown, half the crew would be shivering over the buckets. The ship's doctor, if you could call him that, carried leeches and a saw for amputations. His cure for fever was vinegar-soaked rags and prayers. The young sailor learned quickly. Get sick, and you'd be working anyway. The only rest came when you couldn't stand. Every surface bred mold. Wool clothes never dried, just stayed damp enough to chafe skin raw. Lice moved through the crew like shareholders dividing up property. Men scratched until they bled, then scratched the scabs off. The ship's cat disappeared in the 3rd week. No one asked what happened to it. You could measure time by the growing boldness of the rats. Night watch was the worst. 4 hours in the dark with nothing but a lantern's greasy light, listening to the ship groan like a living thing. The creaking timbers sounded like whispers. Was that the wind, or men plotting mutiny? The young sailor learned to sleep with one hand on his knife. Morning brought no relief. You woke up stiff, damp, and hungry. The bread was weevil-infested, the water green with algae, but you ate it, you drank it, because the alternative was watching your strength fade until you became one of the men who vanished overboard during night watch. Accidentally, of course. Always accidentally. The hierarchy was simple. Officers slept near the stern where the air was slightly better. The cook commandeered the driest patch near the galley. Everyone else fought for whatever space wasn't actively leaking. You didn't complain. A complaining man drew attention, and attention meant extra duties, like scraping the inside of the casks, where the fermented water left a sludge that could choke a horse. By the 2nd month, routines didn't matter. Days blurred into nights. You worked, you ate, you slept in your own filth. The only thing that changed was the shrinking food supply and the growing silence among the crew. No one sang shanties anymore. The ship's bell dictated everything. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, around the clock. No weekends, no breaks. When it clanged, you hauled yourself up the ladder whether you'd slept or not. The young sailor learned quickly, fall behind, and the bosun's rope would remind you why punctuality mattered. Morning watch meant steering by the stars until the sun burned them away. The helmsman gripped the massive tiller, muscles shaking as waves punched the rudder. Others pumped bilge water in shifts, a never-ending battle against the sea. One man worked the handle while his partner scooped out the sludge with a wooden bucket. The smell clung to their hands for days. Every hour, someone climbed the rigging to patch sails. One missed stitch, and the wind would tear the canvas apart by noon. Off-watch didn't mean rest. There were ropes to splice, decks to scrub, and the eternal chore of picking weevils from the biscuit supply. Smart sailors found shadows to work in. Direct sunlight scorched skin already rubbed raw by salt and canvas. You avoided the officers' sightlines. Make eye contact, and suddenly you'd be volunteering to clean the chicken coop lashed to the deck. The birds were more valuable than most of the crew. Lose one, and they deduct its price from your pay. Leisure was a risky luxury. Dice games happened in corners when the mates weren't looking. Stakes were high. A day's ration of wine, the last strip of decent leather for patching boots. Arguments started over nothing. One night, 2 men nearly went overboard fighting about whether Portugal or Castile made better sausages. The young sailor kept his head down. He'd seen what happened to losers. Extra night watches, mouldy rations, accidental shoves near the rail. Storytelling was the safest escape. The old hands spun tales of sea monsters and mermaids, of ports where wine flowed cheaper than water. No one believed them, but it beat staring at the horizon. The stories grew wilder as supplies dwindled. By the 6th week, men swore they'd seen cities of gold just beyond the sunset. The young sailor stopped listening. His own fantasies were simpler. dry clothes, a meal without maggots, silence that didn't feel like the calm before a mutiny. Time warped at sea. Without landmarks, days blurred together. You measured the voyage in losses, another cask of water gone sour, another sailor coughing blood into the bilge. The crew's initial restlessness hardened into resignation. Each noon, when Columbus took his latitude reading, men glanced at the unchanging numbers and said nothing. The officers stopped pretending they knew where they were. Night watch was the worst. Alone at the rail, staring into blackness, the only sounds were sails snapping and the creak of stressed timber. The young sailor watched the stars pivot overhead, wondering if they'd ever stop moving west. Sometimes, in the quiet, he'd hear it. A low murmur from below decks, not snores, not rats. The tense, clipped whispers of men calculating how many officers they'd need to overpower to turn the ship around. By day, everyone played their part. The helmsman steered, the lookouts pretended to scan for land, the carpenter patched leaks that never fully stopped. But the numbers didn't lie. Food stores dwindled, water rationing began. The crew's eyes grew sunken, their movements sluggish. Orders took longer to obey. Even the bosun's whip lost its bite. What was the threat of pain when starvation was already at the door, too? The young sailor worked his shifts like a sleepwalker. Bail, scrub, pump, repeat. The routine kept him alive. Every evening, when the last light bled from the sky, he'd press his ear to the deck boards. Not listening for mutiny this time, just hoping to hear the distant cry of a shorebird, anything to prove they weren't sailing into oblivion. The daily ration was 4 ounces of hardtack and an inch of salted beef, if you were lucky. The hardtack wasn't bread so much as edible plywood. You had to gnaw at it like a dog with a bone, or soak it in water until the weevils floated to the surface. The trick was to tap it hard against the deck first. The impact sent most of the maggots scurrying out of the holes they'd chewed. Even then, you didn't look too closely. The dark patches weren't cloves. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner blurred into one grey paste. The salted meat resembled old shoe leather and smelled worse. Some days it was pork, other days the mystery cut known as salt horse, though no one wanted to ask which part of the animal it came from. You boiled it in the ship's great copper pot until it was soft enough to pretend to chew. Every bite left your mouth drier than before. The ration shrank as the voyage dragged on. By the 6th week, the cooks diced the meat so finely it dissolved into the broth like gristly confetti. Water was currency. The casks turned foul within a month, growing a slimy green film that no amount of straining could fix. Men sipped slowly, holding each mouthful like wine, trying not to gag. You'd trade an extra biscuit for a half cup of the least cloudy water from a fresh cask. Wine rations were a rare luxury, tiny cups of vinegar-thin stuff that burned your throat, but at least killed the taste of everything else. When that ran out, they mixed seawater with the dregs to stretch it further. Thirst became a constant companion, sharper than hunger. The worst days were when the cooks broke into the emergency stores. That meant things were dire. The emergency rations were older than most of the crew. Hardtack from the Moorish wars, cheese that had petrified into something resembling yellow chalk. You had to chip at it with a knife. Some men soaked it in their wine ration overnight just to make it crack apart. By the 8th week, the hunger changed. Not the sharp pangs of the first month, but a dull, hollow feeling that followed you like a shadow. Men stopped joking about the food. They ate mechanically, jaws working through muscle memory. Conversations died. The only sound at meals was the scrape of wooden bowls and the occasional cough. The young sailor noticed how everyone's eyes looked bigger now, how collarbones stuck out like the ridges of a ship's hull. He stopped counting the days. Instead, he counted bites. Each one brought them closer to either land or starvation. Water rationing began in earnest. A single cup per day, measured under the stern overseer's watchful eye. You sipped it slowly, letting each drop coat your tongue. Dreams turned to rivers, to rain barrels overflowing. The crew licked condensation off the decks after storms. When the wine ran out completely, morale sank lower than the waterline. The young sailor kept a secret stash. 2 wrinkled apples he'd stolen during loading in the Canaries. He'd hidden them in a wool sock, wrapped in oilcloth. Some nights, when the hunger gnawed deepest, he'd press a fingernail into one just to smell the tart sweetness. That was enough. For now. The mutiny didn't start with shouts or drawn knives. It began with numbers. Columbus kept 2 logbooks, one with real distances, another with heavily edited figures for the crew. Every morning he'd announce they'd sailed fewer leagues than they actually had. The young sailor noticed the discrepancy when his own body told the truth. His blistered hands knew how many hours he'd hauled ropes. His aching legs remembered the real distance. 2 log. By the 5th week, the crew murmured during night watches. The veterans crouched near the forecastle, using the ship's pitching to mask their voices. The young sailor pretended to sleep nearby, catching fragments. "He's lying about the charts. Water stores won't last. Better to turn back now than die lost." Their whispers carried more danger than any storm. Mutiny on the open sea wasn't just rebellion, it was arithmetic. 30 desperate men versus 10 officers. Those were survivable odds. 2. Columbus played his own game. He curried favor with the malcontents, assigning extra wine rations to the loudest complainers. At night, he paced the quarterdeck like a sentry, keeping the officers armed and alert. The young sailor watched the Captain General's shadow flicker across the sails, a constant reminder that disagreement wouldn't be tolerated. When tempers flared, Columbus would call all hands to admire some meaningless sign. A cloud shaped like land, seaweed that must have drifted from nearby shores. The men nodded, but their eyes stayed hard. The breaking point came during the 8th week. The crew gathered near the mainmast, their silence more threatening than any shouting. The pilot, Juan de la Cosa, stood with folded arms, a dangerous sign. Even officers were wavering. Columbus emerged with his son in one arm and a confident smile. He didn't bring weapons, he brought promises. Just 3 more days, he assured them. The Indies lay just beyond the horizon. The men shuffled, unconvinced. Then he played his final card. A reward for the first man to spot land, extra pensions, glory, a way home, rich instead of disgraced. It bought him time, not loyalty. The young sailor noticed new patterns after that. The helmsman took longer to respond to course corrections. The cooks accidentally burned Columbus's meals. One night, a heavy block came loose from the rigging, crashing inches from the captain's head. No investigation was launched. Everyone knew. No one spoke. The ship developed its own coded language. A drop tankard meant, "We're being watched." A cough during evening rations signaled another discontent had joined the fold. The young sailor kept his head down, but his ears open. The mutiny planners underestimated how sound carried below decks. He heard names, dates, the click of a whetstone on steel. They planned to act when the moon waned, when darkness would hide their movements. Columbus must have sensed it. The next morning, he called the entire crew to witness a bizarre ceremony. Using an hourglass and quadrant, he announced they'd entered waters no European had ever sailed. The air changed. Even the mutineers hesitated. If they turned back now, they'd forfeit their place in history. Columbus didn't scold or threaten. He simply reminded them, greatness required suffering. The men dispersed quietly. That night, the young sailor watched the conspirators argue in hushed fury near the chicken coop. Some wanted to proceed. Others feared divine punishment for killing the man who might lead them to paradise. The debate ended abruptly when a shooting star streaked overhead, an omen even the skeptics couldn't ignore. By dawn, the tension remained, but the edge had dulled. Columbus increased the wine ration again. He pointed out drifting branches, claiming they proved land was near. The crew pretended to believe him. The young sailor noticed the bosun's whip had disappeared. No one mentioned it. The mutiny hadn't ended. It had just moved underground, waiting for the right moment or the wrong calculation. Then came the birds. On the 71st morning, the young sailor woke to shouting overhead. Not the usual curses or calls to trim sails. This was something sharper. He scrambled up the ladder, nearly slipping on the dew-slick steps. There, circling the mainmast like a clock hand gone rogue, flew a lone tern. Its white wings caught the dawn light as it banked just above the rigging. No one moved. Seabirds meant nothing on the open ocean, unless they didn't. Experienced hands knew most species stayed within 100 miles of shore. This one shouldn't exist here. The crew stared as if it were a ghost. The young sailor watched a feather drift down and land near the helmsman's foot. The man crossed himself so fast he nearly lost grip of the tiller. Columbus seized the moment. He ordered extra rations, declaring the bird God's own confirmation that land lay near. The men ate their doubled portions silently, chewing with furrowed brows. Hope was more dangerous than hunger now. Believe too much, and disappointment could turn violent. The young sailor noticed the mutineers glancing at each other, postponing plans, not abandoning them. 2 days later, another sign, a green branch floating in the water, its leaves still fresh. Then drifting reeds, then a carved stick. Each scrap sparked desperate theories. Some swore they smelled earth on the wind. Others muttered about sea monsters luring ships to their doom. The young sailor watched the western horizon until his eyes burned. Every shadow became a coastline. Every odd cloud shape morphed into mountains. Sleep brought dreams of palm trees that dissolved into mist by dawn. On October 11th, the tension snapped. At dusk, Columbus ordered the sails reefed, an absurd decision when every league counted. He announced they'd sail slowly through the night to avoid missing land in darkness. The crew exchanged glances. This was the captain's final gamble. If dawn revealed empty ocean, even his allies might throw him overboard. That night no one slept. Men clustered along the rails, straining their eyes. The young sailor perched in the rigging, ignoring the rope burns on his palms. Around midnight, he spotted a flicker of light in the distance, a pinprick that vanished when he blinked. He stayed silent. False alarms got men whipped. Then, just past 2 a.m, a cannon shot split the darkness. The Pinta, sailing ahead, had seen something. The sailor's stomach dropped as shouts carried across the water. The crew erupted into chaos, some weeping, others laughing like madmen. Columbus dropped to his knees on the quarterdeck, hands shaking as he clutched a crucifix. The young sailor simply gripped the mast, unable to process what they'd done. Land. Actual land. No fantasies, no mirages. Grey cliffs silhouetted against the paling sky. As daylight grew, details emerged. Trees, beaches, smoke from distant fires. The ship fell eerily quiet. No cheers, no celebrations. Just 40 men staring at a shoreline that didn't appear on any of their maps. The scale of their discovery crashed over them like a wave. Whatever lay ahead, riches, monsters, salvation. Europe's world had just grown unimaginably larger. The young sailor realized he was crying, not from joy, but from the sheer weight of the unknown. Yesterday they were doomed men on a suicidal voyage. Today they were either history's greatest explorers or its biggest fools. The Santa Maria's boats were lowered in tense silence. Someone had to go ashore first. Volunteers stepped forward slowly, like men approaching a gallows rather than a discovery. The young sailor found himself gripping an oar he didn't remember picking up. As the rowboat pulled away from the ship, he stared at the approaching beach. Every stroke took them further from everything they knew. The dawn of October 12th, 1492, didn't feel real. The young sailor gripped the rail until his knuckles turned white, staring at the thin brown lines smudged across the horizon. No one celebrated, no one even spoke. After 70 days of empty ocean, their eyes couldn't process what they were seeing. The crew stood frozen, half expecting the land to dissolve like all the other mirages. Only when the smell hit them, wet earth, green things growing, did the shaking start. The Santa Maria drifted closer, sails limp in the morning calm. Details emerged through the haze. Palm trees bending in the breeze, white sand, strange birds taking flight. The young sailor's throat clenched. None of Columbus's maps described this coastline. Every textbook in Europe was wrong. That skeletal fear returned. They'd reached a place with no rules, no charts, no way home. The mutineers looked more terrified than anyone. Their knives stayed sheathed. Boats were lowered with mechanical precision. No one wanted to be first ashore. When Columbus called for volunteers, men suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere. The young sailor got picked simply because he'd hesitated too long. He climbed down into the longboat, feeling like he was stepping into his own grave. The reality grew stranger with every oar stroke. The water changed color, deep blue giving way to turquoise so bright it hurt the eyes. Fish darted beneath them, shapes and colors no European had names for. As the keel scraped sand, the young sailor realized his hands were trembling too badly to tie the rope. Columbus stepped past him onto the beach like a man walking into church. They'd rehearsed this moment for months. The banners, the declarations, the sword ceremonies. Up close, it felt absurd. The young sailor stood knee-deep in surf, watching Columbus plant a flag in sand that would swallow it whole by noon. The Captain General claimed the land for Spain in a loud voice, naming it San Salvador. Nobody listening understood a word. Something moved in the trees. The crew reached for weapons, but what emerged wasn't monsters or demons, just people. Naked, dark-skinned, staring at the Europeans with the same bewildered fear. The young sailor's sword suddenly felt heavy in his hand. These weren't the silk-robed merchants of the East they'd been promised. No spices, no gold, just wide-eyed fishermen clutching simple spears. Trade began awkwardly. The natives offered parrot feathers and woven baskets. The sailors handed over brass buttons and red caps, both sides marveling at the other's primitive trinkets. The young sailor noticed how the islanders flinched at the Spaniards' pale skin, how they touched the ship's planks like they might vanish. He understood the feeling. By sunset, the crew had drunk themselves stupid on local fruit wine. Columbus paced the beach, scribbling notes about rivers of gold just inland. The young sailor sat apart, letting warm waves lap over his feet. His mind kept snagging on details. The way the stars looked different here. How the night air clung moist and thick. They'd done the impossible. They'd crossed the ocean sea and lived. Yet, as he watched the bonfire light flicker on his shipmates' faces, all he felt was dread. This wasn't a triumphant return. It was the beginning of something none of them could control. The Santa Maria's captain was already talking about pressing onward, searching for cities that didn't exist. The young sailor stared at the dark jungle. Morning would bring more discoveries, more misunderstandings, more irreversible choices. For now, he sat on sand, still warm from a sun that had set hours ago, a continent of unknowns at his back. The voyage home would be worse. But first, they had to survive this new world they'd stumbled into. Christmas Eve, 1492, began quietly. The Santa Maria drifted along Haiti's coast while most of the crew slept. The young sailor stood watch, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of insects buzzing from shore. There was no moon, no warning, just a sudden lurch as the ship struck something solid. The impact shuddered through the hull like a hammer blow. By the time Columbus reached the deck, water was already seeping through the seams. The Santa Maria had rammed a coral reef at high tide. The crew stumbled into action, hauling barrels and sacks onto the deck. Panic set in slowly. They'd survived months at sea, only to drown within sight of land. The young sailor worked the bilge pumps until his arms gave out, but the sea kept rising. Dawn revealed their doom. The hull was split open like a gutted fish. Salvage operations began immediately. Columbus ordered everything of value stripped from the ship. Weapons, tools, even the nails. The young sailor spent hours waist-deep in brine, passing timbers to shore. Every plank was precious now. Without the Santa Maria, There wouldn't be enough room on the remaining ships for everyone to return. Someone would have to stay behind. The wreck changed everything. Columbus saw an opportunity. He announced they'd build a fort with the salvaged wood. La Navidad, Europe's first foothold in the New World. 39 men would remain as colonists, lured by promises of first pick when the gold shipments started. The young sailor watched them celebrate their good fortune, knowing none realized they were being left as human markers to stake Spain's claim. Construction was shoddy at best. The fort's walls stood crooked, its thatch roof leaked, and the natives watched their efforts with confusion. The young sailor helped lash together palm fronds for shelter, knowing they wouldn't last through storm season. Columbus didn't care. He just needed something standing long enough to impress the crown back home. On January 2nd, the Niña and Pinta prepared to sail for Spain. The colonists lined up on shore, waving like men at a funeral. The young sailor counted faces as they rowed away, 39 Europeans left with no supply line, no maps home, and only the vaguest idea of where they actually were. The Santa Maria's wreckage lapped at the shore behind them, its ribs bleaching in the sun. The remaining ships were dangerously overcrowded. Men slept piled atop each other, the stench of unwashed bodies mixing with mildew from their damp clothes. The young sailor squeezed into a space barely wider than his shoulders, listening to the new sounds of the rebuilt fleet, the Niña's pumps working overtime, the Pinta's patched sails groaning under pressure. Every creak reminded him how fragile their return journey would be. Columbus seemed almost pleased by the disaster. The wreck gave him leverage, proof they needed more ships, more men, more funding. He dictated the official report with dramatic flair, spinning the accident as divine intervention, forcing them to establish a settlement. The young sailor watched him practice expressions for the royals, smoothing his salt-stained doublet like a performer preparing for an audience. Two worlds had collided that Christmas Eve, one sinking into the reef, another rising from its timbers. As Haiti's coastline faded behind them, the young sailor wondered which would prove more doomed, those left behind in their flimsy fort, or those setting sail on rotting ships toward an ocean that had already tried to kill them once. The Santa Maria's bones would bleach on that foreign shore, its name now tied forever to a shoreline no European had known existed 3 months prior. The wreck forced history's hand. Without it, Columbus might have sailed home with nothing but strange fruits and wild tales. Instead, he returned with a story of claimed lands and waiting colonists, the seed of an empire. The young sailor would hear the official version, told in Spanish courts later, polished and perfected. But he'd remember the truth: a dark night, a splintering hull, and 39 doomed men cheering as their only way home vanished over the horizon. The sailor never learned what happened to La Navidad's colonists. Not until it was too late. When Columbus returned to Haiti on his second voyage in November 1493, he found the fort's charred remains and 39 unmarked graves. The settlement had lasted less than a year. The men left behind had succumbed to their own recklessness. Without ships or supervision, they'd raided nearby Taino villages for food and women. Greed turned fatal quickly. Some colonists chased rumors of gold inland and vanished. Others died in ambushes after stealing from the wrong chief. The last holdouts turned on each other, fighting over dwindling supplies until the Taino finished the job. The young sailor heard the details years later from a survivor, how the natives had burned the fort under a full moon, how the screams hadn't lasted long. Columbus spun the disaster as indigenous treachery, but the sailor knew the truth. Those men weren't pioneers, they were castaways. The Santa Maria's wreck had stranded them with no medicine, no farming knowledge, and no way to communicate. Their colony was a desperate gamble that collapsed under its own arrogance. The sailor sometimes wondered which corpse belonged to the boatswain who'd whipped him, or the cook who burned their meals. No one bothered marking the bodies. The returning crew of the Niña and Pinta became unwitting celebrities. Their survival was a miracle. 2 rotting ships packed with men, sailing back across the Atlantic without proper charts. Half the crew had dysentery by the time they reached the Azores. Their water ran out entirely 3 days from Spain. The young sailor remembered licking condensation off the deck to stay alive. When they finally limped into Palace Harbour in March 1493, the town erupted. People swarmed the docks, shouting questions about the new world. The sailor kept his mouth shut. He'd watched Columbus coach the crew on what to say. Gold, spices, and easy conquest featured heavily. The reality of Haiti's hungry colonists and confused natives didn't match the fairy tale. But no one wanted the truth. They wanted marvels. The sailor became an unwilling expert overnight. Tavern patrons bought him drinks to describe the Taino. Merchants offered coins for samples of the strange plants he'd stuffed in his pockets. He showed one man a dried chili pepper. The idiot bit into it whole and screamed himself hoarse. The sailor pocketed the coin anyway. Back in Haiti, that pepper could have bought a week's peace with the natives. Survival carried unexpected perks. The sailor's old debts were forgotten. His criminal record mysteriously disappeared. Even the scar on his cheek from the bosun's whip somehow made him look heroic. People called him the explorer now, as if he'd charted those waters himself instead of nearly starving on them. Columbus, of course, reveled in the glory. The sailor attended the Captain General's audience with Ferdinand and Isabella, standing at the back while Columbus displayed captured Taino, strange birds, and nuggets of fool's gold. No one mentioned La Navidad's fate yet. That story would wait until Columbus needed more ships. The sailor watched the royals lean forward, fascinated by descriptions of docile natives, perfect for enslaving. Their eyes glittered brighter than any of Columbus's trinkets. The sailor slipped out before the feasting began. He walked the streets of Barcelona that night, breathing air that didn't stink of bilge or rotting fruit. His pay from the voyage, modest by noble standards, was more coin than he'd ever held. People nudged each other as he passed. Whispers followed him. That one sailed with Columbus. He bought new boots first, then a proper cloak. By summer, he'd secured work as a consultant for merchants financing the second voyage. They paid handsomely for his warnings about coral reefs and hurricane seasons. The sailor never mentioned the 39 men they were sending to their deaths. Some lessons couldn't be taught, only learned the hard way. History would remember La Navidad as a tragedy. The sailor knew better. It was a preview. As he watched the second expedition's massive fleet preparing Cadiz, 17 ships, 1,200 men, he recognized the same hungry looks from the Santa Maria's crew. They weren't explorers. They were invaders. And this time, they'd come prepared to stay. The sailor stepped onto Palace's docks in March 1493, looking like a ghost wearing rags. His skin was still burned from months at sea, his clothes stiff with salt. But something had changed, the way people stared. Before the voyage, they'd crossed the street to avoid him. Now merchants pressed forward, offering free wine just to hear his stories. Nobody asked about the dysentery or the rotten food. They wanted marvels. Did the natives really have gold in their rivers? Can the trees there cure diseases? The sailor learned to embellish. A Taino fishing village became a city, a handful of copper trinkets transformed into proof of unimaginable wealth. Truth didn't matter. Europe was hungry for legends. His new status shocked him. The pardon for his criminal record came first, a royal edict declaring all Columbus's crew heroes of the realm. Then came the job offers. Ship owners hired him as a consultant, paying good silver for warnings about Caribbean reefs and currents. A wool merchant commissioned him to describe Taino weaving techniques. Even the local priest invited him to lecture at the church school. The sailor, who'd never held a pen before, suddenly found his opinions valuable. Money flowed in strange ways. He received a bonus just for attending planning meetings about the second voyage. Nobles tipped him to recite the same tired stories at their banquets. When he mentioned once that Taino women wove cotton hammocks, 3 different workshops hired him to demonstrate the knots, though he'd never actually made one himself. Within months, he'd saved enough to buy a small house near the docks. The social climb was more surreal. The same officials who'd once sentenced him now clapped him on the back. The sailor caught his reflection sometimes in shop windows. Same scarred face, same rough hands. But now he wore a woolen doublet instead of rags. People called him Don, as a joke at first, then in earnest. His old crimes became adventurous misdeeds, his poverty a romantic backstory. Columbus's growing fame lifted all his men. When the admiral paraded through Barcelona with 6 captured Tainos and a collection of exotic parrots, the sailor walked in the procession. He watched nobles gasp at the exhibits, the gold nose rings, the strange fruits preserved in brandy. Nobody seemed to notice the hollowness in the natives' eyes. Afterward, a count's secretary offered him 50 ducats just to introduce them to Columbus. The sailor learned to navigate this new world of soft hands and hidden daggers. He traded his rough speech for cautious phrases, discovered which silences made him seem wise. When a royal commissioner pressed him about conditions in Haiti, he chose his words carefully. The land is rich beyond measure if you know where to look. He didn't mention La Navidad's charred ruins. By the time the second voyage launched in September 1493, the sailor had a choice. Return to the New World as an officer, or stay and grow his newfound respect. He chose the latter. Columbus took 1,200 men this time, mostly convicts and desperate farmers, just like he'd been. Let them play at being conquerors. By the time the second voyage launched in September 1493, the sailor had a choice. Return to the New World as an officer, or stay and grow his newfound respect. He chose the latter. Columbus took 1,200 men this time, mostly convicts and desperate farmers just like he'd been. Let them play at being conquerors. Instead, he married a shipbuilder's widow, invested in 2 merchant vessels, and bought a seat on the town council. His past became an asset. When maritime disputes arose, they deferred to the man who'd sailed with Columbus. Sometimes late at night he'd stand on his balcony overlooking the docks and watch the tide roll in. The salt air still carried whispers of that first terrifying voyage. History would remember Columbus, the kings, the queens. But for men like him, the nameless, the desperate, the lucky, the real discovery wasn't new lands. It was realizing survival could be its own kind of triumph. The sailor who'd once slept in ship's filth now kept a silver cup on his table. He drank from it every morning, marveling at its weight. Europe had given him something far stranger than gold, a second life. The sailor never set out to make history. He just didn't want to die. But survival has its own rewards. While Columbus took the glory, men like him got something rarer, a stolen second chance. That ragged criminal who boarded the Santa Maria returned a respectable man, his past erased by the sheer audacity of staying alive. History loves its heroes, but empires are built by desperate men. The real discovery wasn't new lands, it was realizing even the lowest could rise. One voyage changed his fate entirely, from the bilge to the banquet hall, all because he endured when others didn't.